Okay, good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to our US and Canada import rules webinar. Um, I myself am Lauren Hughes. I'm an international trade advisor for the Chamber, and we are joined with Alessio from our partner VATIT stream. I'm just going to run through some introductory slides based on the Chamber and the services that we provide, and then I will hand over to Alessio for him to start his discussion about the topic. Just to make everybody aware, the webinar will be recorded this morning, and you will be able to get the recording from our International Trade Hub along with the slides. I will send those out in a follow-up email once the webinar has been completed. So for those who are members, you might already know this, but for those of you who aren't, the Greater Manchester Chamber was founded a very long time ago, over 230 years ago. We do cover all local areas within the Greater Manchester region. So obviously that would be Bolton Bury, Trafford, Wigan, Tameside, Oldham, Rochdale, Stockport, Manchester and Salford. However, we do have a number of overseas members. We have members from outside of the region. We are the largest chamber within the UK. As you will see, we've got over 4,200 members. They span across all sectors. That can be SMEs, it can be large companies that turn over millions every year. Just obviously offering whatever support they need, whether it be international from myself and my department, or whether it be from local support within the community. We've won numerous awards. We can give you support in PR, networking. Obviously, that would then tailor in with our events. We host over 200 events every year. Again, that can be the chamber events, which are hosted, like manufacturing, property and construction, or whether that be virtual events like this one, or whether it be any international event that we host in person, which some of you might have been to or might not have been to. Obviously, then we've got our global network, that can obviously lead to introductions with people like Alessio, who can support your business overseas, anywhere in the world, or we can put you in touch with people who can help you with warehousing, any customs, border force, anything along the lines like that, or whether it's just putting you in touch with people who can support with funding if you might need it. Yeah, anything like that really, obviously just to help support your business to go global, to be better in the region. We're here to cover all. We are currently also working on an enhanced partnership that would be with ourselves, the GMCA, which is Andy Burnham's office, the Combined Authority, the Department of Business and Trade, and Growth Hub. Obviously, just to keep us more streamlined, more aligned, so people know who to go to, what to talk about. Now, just to touch briefly on to the international trade support, which I work in with 4 other people. It would be myself, Francesco, Julia, and Amy. Francesco and Julia are also international trade advisors. Amy heads up the head of international trade. And then we have 4 other lovely ladies that work on our export documentation team that can help you with any certificates, carnets, any type of export documentation, whether you need any type of authorized signature or anything along the lines of that. We can also support you with any market entry services. So whether you need support on identifying a market that you want to branch out to, whether you only ship to Europe and you want to go further afield to maybe the GCC UAE region, or whether you want to branch out to America, whether you want to go to Africa, Australia, anywhere like that, we can support you with that. We do lots of training. Obviously, we do our training services, which can be held in person. We can come to your office. You can come to see us in person, whichever works best. We'll always accommodate. We do host a number of training sessions every year, and you can then get your foundation award if you complete 6 of the BCC accredited courses through ourselves. We can support you with compliance. That can be rules of origin, tariff classification, your customs procedures and customs controls, whether you need any licenses for exporting or anything along the lines of that. And then any of that support, we can support you. We can put you in touch with partners, again, like Alessio, and they'll be able to support you with anything along the lines of that. Again, just to touch briefly, we can obviously support with any documentation. Again, apostles, if you ever needed anything like that, if you ever needed signatures on commercial documents, we can support with that. Arab documents, EUR ones, anything along the lines. We are a customs broker, so we can do your imports and exports. We can do IPATs, GVMS, help with transits, anything to do with customs clearance, we are able to support. And then you're getting paid services. So if you need any help with foreign exchange, credit checks, insurance, letters of credit, we can also support with that. And then lastly, from my side, of course, again, just our international events and courses, like today or like in person. We do encourage, because you just never know who you might be in the room with, who might be able to support your business to do better. That's why we always encourage people to come to our events. If you do want to know more about our events, then I highly encourage you to go into the International Trade Hub. Again, I will send all of this out in my follow-up email at the end of the webinar this afternoon. We have our Trade Hub resources where you can get recordings from previous webinars like this. You can get the slides, you can get any materials. It can be official notices on how to fill out a certificate of origin or an EUR1. And then we've got our US tariff support hub, where we, for the past year nearly now, we have done a calendar of events that have just happened from January to December based on what's been going on with US tariffs. And obviously then you can get all of the fact sheets that have come straight from the White House if needs be. But yeah, we're here to support, help you to go global. But I will stop rabbiting on now, and I will pass over to Alessio, and he can show you his slides and do his wonderful presentation. So I'll stop sharing now and I will let you share, Alessio.
Thank you very much, Lauren. If you can just give me 1 second while I share my presentation. If you just give me 1 second here. Thank you very much for the introduction, Lauren, and I really appreciate you taking the time to allow us to speak to everyone today. And good morning to everyone. So as Lauren mentioned, my name is Alessio, and I'm from a company by the name of VATIT Stream. So what we do is we help businesses from a logistics and a taxation perspective, specifically within the realms of VAT, and ultimately try and encompass the worlds of logistics compliance and the actual physical movement of goods. I think what we've seen in this world, specifically in 2025 in particular, whether you're moving goods into Europe or you're moving goods into the US or Canada for that matter, the worlds of compliance and logistics are becoming ever further entwined. And the ultimate aspect that we just need to consider is that there are no longer two worlds that live separately from each other. They do have direct implications on each other. And that's some of the aspects that we'll be speaking today about trade between North America and the UK. So I think one of the crucial topics for many businesses, specifically in the UK, is they're either looking to expand or sustain trade with North America. And I think today, focusing on the US and Canada in particular, these markets need no mention that they are the largest trading markets for UK businesses. This year's trade is estimated between £200 billion between goods and services, specifically from an export perspective for UK-based businesses. And that UK-North America relationship is deeply rooted. I think we see the similarities in a vast number of ways. We've got shared languages, we've got shared legal systems, as well as very close innovation ties. And if we look at 2025, I believe we've seen a large variety in volatility, not only in the financial markets, but more particular within terms of logistics and trade compliance. And that changing landscape means that success is no longer completely reliant on a great product. It doesn't supersede any of the other challenges anymore, unfortunately. And it's ultimately about understanding and managing those regulatory environments effectively. And that's something we'll touch on today. So looking at the UK and US trade in particular, and something I want to speak about in succession is that we'll look at the US first and then touch on Canada a little later, is that although there's been a period of turbulence, we've seen significant shifts also have a profound impact on a number of businesses. I think the volatility in the US import tariffs post-elections was a big one. So these policies, unfortunately, are ever-changing and to a large degree uncertain. Then we've also seen the removal of de minimis, which has had a big effect on a large number of lower value shippers and shipments in particular. Essentially, this exemption no longer exists for many goods. And along with that, there's been an increased focus on customs enforcement priorities. So meaning US authorities are basically scrutinizing imports closer than ever before. And then I think let's also not forget that there's also ongoing currency fluctuations. I think the volatility that we've seen in the US markets has naturally also affected the value of the US dollar. And those forex trades that were arguably quite insignificant in terms of their variation have seen larger degrees of standard deviation in terms of how that volatility has played out. But I think for us, the biggest impact has been particularly seen by smaller businesses. SMEs in particular are feeling the pressure. I think there's been this increased administration on paperwork and more stringent requirements. And there's this ongoing requirement for these businesses to stay agile in this environment, and it's become more important than ever before. So let's look at de minimis. As mentioned, this has been one of the largest regulatory changes we've seen this year. And for context, this rule allowed for goods valued under a certain value, particularly $800, to be exempt from all tariffs and other import duties when being imported into the US. Now, that exemption ultimately, as of a couple months ago, has disappeared. And ultimately, all shipments, regardless of their value, now undergo full customs clearance. So this affects not just the paperwork burden, but also the entire way in which businesses ultimately approach importing their goods into the US. And we've seen a much larger requirement for DDP shipments. And the reason why is that it's caused businesses to rethink the way in which they perform these shipments. A large aspect of it is because many clients that are purchasing low-value shipments, it was basically as easy as a domestic transaction in the US. But now they are being contacted by the customs broker or by US Customs to pay over import duties and tariffs for goods that ultimately moved in duty-free prior to that. So for many clients, they're seeing this as hidden costs. I think if we look at this table on this slide in particular, one of the biggest changes that we'll see is specifically at point 3, whereby prior there would have just been the basic customs clearance. So there was not a full requirement for the movement of these goods in. There was much less documentation required. And these goods were cleared duty-free. Now we see that there's a full customs declaration that's ultimately required. So all shipments have to move in with full product details, HTS codes, commercial invoices, packing lists. And that is ultimately what is used to determine the duties and tariffs that are ultimately applied to these shipments. Once that has all been derived, that will automatically be submitted to the American ACE portal. And ultimately, that is what will then determine the complete importation of these goods into the US. So these are all the aspects that we've ultimately seen. And I think a large aspect of it has had a large ripple effect on many businesses. So the removal of de minimis isn't only the only change that's causing these compliance issues in the US. These effects ultimately extend across the entire process, starting at the US border. There are now more steps required for submitting documentation, as we've seen, and which means that there's longer delays in paperwork if it's not ultimately completely in order. And it's not necessarily just about filling forms. Customs agents are spending more time reviewing the accuracy and completeness of every shipment. And I think it's also important to recognize the fact that the more workload that there is for agents, it could also lead to more delays and potential penalties and even rejections if something is missed. And the key here is understanding the responsibility and compliance, that it doesn't solely rest with the US customs agents anymore. It ultimately relies with you as the exporter to ensure that everything is right, from the HTS code to the origin of goods before the shipment even leaves the UK. And I think it's also important to recognize the fact that customs agents at the end of the day are human. the more overworked a human is, the more granular they are to firstly inspecting these goods, but also that the more prone they are to mistakes. And that's why it's important to basically take away as much capacity within the customs agent's ability to use their discretion in terms of how a good should be used or cleared. And that's something we'll touch on now on this next slide. And I think I drum on this point because it's something that's very important to recognize, that customs at the end of the day are run by human beings, and human beings, as much as we would like to believe they are objective, we have to account for a degree of subjectivity. And how we account for that degree of subjectivity is to remove it in its entirety, to ensure that all our documentation is in order and in the most concise and detailed manner possible. Now, let's dive also into the aspect of HTS code classifications. And this leads quite closely to what we were speaking about with the removal of de minimis. So for many of those who might not necessarily be aware, the HTS code system used in the US to classify goods is similar to the UK system and more internationally adopted system of HS codes, but there are key differences. For example, in the UK, we use an 8-digit system, whereas in the US, they use an additional 2 digits to take them to a full complement of a 10-digit code. Now, where this vast differentiation ultimately comes into place is on the last 4 digits of the US code. Although the first 6 digits of both codes might match, the last 4 digits of the US HTS code make up the difference in terms of tariffs. So if you're importing goods, something like a handbag, if we look in the example on this page, the difference in the HTS code can mean a significant change in the duty rate, because although the UK HS code might be sufficiently described, the US HTS code goes into more granular detail, and we can see how, although the first 6 digits are similar, there's 3 variations that we could ultimately apply to that. And that goes down to the actual material that these goods are ultimately made out of. Now, you might think, what is the material difference here? This is the material difference. It can have a significant effect on the ultimate landed cost of your goods, because we can see a variance of 3.3% to as high as 7.8% on the actual duty rate applied to these goods into the US. Now, if we don't consign this correctly, this is ultimately something that's going to be borne by your customer if you're shipping these goods on a DDU basis, or you're leaving it to the discretion of a customs agent. And that's the last thing that we ultimately want to do, because you can send 2 exactly the same shipments with the same UK HS code applied to the commercial invoice, and you can see 2 completely different US duty rates being applied to these goods because you haven't consigned it with the correct HTS code equivalent. This is something we help a number of clients with, and so does the chamber. I know we've done a lot of work on this previously. So it's a very easy thing to remedy and rectify, but it is something that needs to be ultimately taken into consideration and ultimately applied for. Now, the next aspect to look at is tariff exemption codes. And I think this has been something that's naturally been brought upon quite drastically by the application of reciprocal tariffs, or IEEPA tariffs in the US. So in addition to normal proper classification, it's now also crucial to be aware of tariff exemption codes. So these are special codes that are used in conjunction with the HTS code, and that's an important distinction. It's not a replacement of the HTS code that applies to your item. And this can help certain goods be exempt from tariffs or benefit from lower duty rates. So, for example, goods shipped from the UK might be eligible for duty exemptions under certain conditions, such as repair and returns, temporary imports. And to illustrate this, I use this example below, whereby we see that this HTS code used refers to printed material or printed pictures or something of that nature. Now, naturally, these goods, if they are of UK origin, would have a 10% reciprocal tariff. Would have a 10% reciprocal tariff because they are of UK origin. But because we have applied the exemption code 9903, as you see in this blue box at the bottom, it will remove that 10% tariff in totality. So these goods move in duty-free as well as tariff-free. Now, it is important to recognize that this isn't applicable to all products, or all commodities rather, but it is applicable to certain types of commodities. And it's important to investigate how applicable this might ultimately be in certain instances. Now, we've spoken about what these changes are, but I think it's also important to recognize the operational impact this has had on a number of British businesses. And where we've seen this have the largest impact is particularly in two primary industries, particularly e-commerce and fashion, and secondarily manufacturing and spare parts. On the e-commerce perspective, we've seen this impact quite significantly felt with the removal of de minimis, as well as specifics around the country of origin. Although many of these businesses might be UK-based and registered UK entities, the products that they've been selling into the US markets more often than not are not of UK country of origin. So in many instances, we're seeing countries of origin such as India as well as China, which have significantly higher protective tariffs being imposed on them purely because of their country of origin. Now, what the net effect of this has been is that we're seeing a 20% downward trend in exports across the greater industry. Now, the impact of this is twofold. We're seeing some companies reducing the type of commodities that they are shipping into these regions. So they might be excluding certain countries of origin, or other companies in totality have just stopped shipping their goods completely into the US. Now, this does have a net effect, obviously, on these businesses' bottom lines, but it's a business decision that they've ultimately had to make until they can pivot at such time that it makes it feasible for them to do it again. If we look at manufacturing and spare parts, a large part of this is due to the Incoterm that many of these businesses have used. A large number of them ship their goods on a DAP or DDU basis, which made the payment of duties the consignee's responsibility, or the importer of records responsibility. What they've now seen is, because there's been very little consistency in the landed cost of these goods because of how, firstly, the documentation is being consigned, it hasn't been done well enough. So you're seeing, as we've spoken about previously, a variance in the type of duty and tariff rates being applied. But secondarily, to the customer in the US purchasing these goods, there seems to be an inconsistency in the landed cost. They're being told the value of goods is X, but when these goods land and clear in the US, they're seeing a value of X plus Y. And it's not a good relationship for many customers to ultimately find themselves in. So this ultimately has brought about a certain realization of the financial viability of this trade lane for many businesses. It's brought that into question, especially when we're speaking about items such as spare parts, or even if we extend this to e-commerce and fashion that traditionally operate in very thin margins because they are a volume-based business. So we've spoken about the issues, we've spoken about the operational impact of this, but what are the solutions that businesses can ultimately remedy these issues with? And we speak about this as future-proofing for the US. And the first one is to consider registering as a US importer. So this doesn't require you to act as, to open up another entity in the US or register for an LLC or anything to that effect. It allows you to register with the US Importers Code. And this would basically allow you to act as both the exporter as well as the importer of goods. So theoretically being able to facilitate a true DDP movement of goods into the US. Why do this? Because it ultimately shields your clients from unexpected duties and tariffs, because you are in control of that import process. So you've got a much greater ability to basically just allow them to act as the consignee of these goods. And it allows you to also offer your clients that all-in landed cost. So you pivot towards a degree of greater certainty that ultimately allows you to maintain that relationship with your client in a much better way. The second aspect of it is looking at inbound consolidation. So why has this been important? Specifically for low-valued goods, It allows you to basically group a whole bunch of smaller shipments into one unified clearance. What would then happen is these goods would then go onto a 3PL where they wouldn't be stored or anything to that effect, but basically this larger consolidation would then be broken down into smaller shipments that are then distributed for final mile distribution across the entirety of the US. Now, these consolidations, we would recommend doing it with company-only consolidation, so you wouldn't be consolidating your goods with other businesses, but rather with your own goods. And this is something that we've seen reduce the overall shipping and handling costs in order to offset the increase in tariffs. So although you might not necessarily be getting rid of the tariff implication on your business, the scales of economy of grouping a bunch of smaller shipments into one shipment for customs clearance allows you to see a significant saving on the cost of the freight to offset that increase in costing due to tariffs. The third aspect of it is something that is less of a change, but more where we speak about the granular attention to documentation. And this is something that both ourselves and the Chamber believe very strongly in, and something that we can definitely assist with. Because all descriptions, HTS codes, origin information, and accurate consolidation of your actual documentation are imperative to a successful shipment. We ultimately need to minimize that discretionary decision that is implied by any customs agent, especially given the heightened atmosphere that we've seen with international imports into the US this specific year. Now, we are going to move on to Canada, and I'm sure there will be some questions from the floor. But something that we'll do towards the end of this is that we'll have a bit of a Q&A session where we'll then touch on the different aspects. So, as discussed, switching gears to Canada, despite its proximity to the US, I've seen this happen on countless occasions, but many businesses underestimate the complexity of shipping to Canada. It's very different to the US, and it's not just the logistics function of shipping your goods there. It involves a complicated attribute of taxation, customs, and compliance processes that are unique in their requirements and need to be treated with a certain degree of care. And the one thing that I just want to start with is to understand the difference between the Canadian Revenue Agency and the Canadian Border Services Agency, and the key roles that they ultimately play with managing the import process into Canada. So it's important to understand that the CRA handles tax compliance, while the CBSA is in charge of border security and customs clearance. So although they work very closely together and are often seen as one institution, there are two separate institutions that play a clear and definitive role of their own. And I think what we'll look at today will focus primarily around importers code registration once again, customs clearance, import security, and tax registration, and how these four factors ultimately affect the successful importation of goods into Canada. So if we look at the overall arching problem, is that we will see goods that originate in the UK. They are prepared and ready for export on DDP terms out of a UK warehouse. So they ultimately leave your facility. These goods will then be transported by a freight provider, and they will then ultimately reach the Canadian border. Now, this is where the carrier or the broker will present all the details of the shipments to the CBSA. So there will be a documentation check to ensure the importer's identity and all those attributes of the shipment. Now, at this point, the CBSA will then also do a validation. So they will look at the value, the HS codes, and the duty rates that are being applied to these goods. Now, at this point, they will also look and validate that whoever is acting as the importer of these goods has registered on a platform called the CALM platform, and they've got a valid CALM account, as well as having a bond facility. And these are two factors that we'll touch on in the next slide, or the slide after the next slide. And once this has all been done, the customs broker will submit these declarations on the importer's behalf. Once this process has been done, this is where the CRA will now step in, and they will now manage the BN number, which which is also another topic we'll touch on, and the GST or HST compliance. So they will ensure that the registered importers file the correct reclaim facilitations and that the GST is being paid over correctly at importation, and ensure that all financial attributes of the actual shipment, so from a customs clearance perspective, correspond with all of the import data that has been submitted with the actual shipment. So because this customs process is now digitized, there's a lot further checks and balances, both from a documentation, a customs clearance perspective, and a value perspective of the actual shipment. Now, the issue with this is how we've outlined this is that this is one big fragmented process. The reason being is that you've got yourself, the UK seller, who's acting as the shipper. There's a carrier or a forwarder who is either appointing a customs broker or has a team locally that is acting as the customs broker. And then you've also got the involvement of someone like an accountant from a revenue agency's perspective that is helping you facilitate the GST compliance. So the issue here is that there's no shared responsibility. There's no communication between all these players. So ultimately, there's no accountability throughout this entire process. So this lack of coordination leads to inefficiencies and ultimately, in many instances, costly mistakes. So the goal here is to bring all parties into one streamlined process where the communication is outlined effectively, and to ensure a smoother operation and compliant process in totality. So as promised, we'll look at the three primary factors that we need to consider. The first is a business number. So a business number in many attributes is basically your company's identity in Canada for all things tax and import related. Without it, you will not be able to ultimately import goods on a DDP basis, whether you are a Canadian business fully domiciled in Canada or you're a foreign business looking to act as the importer of goods being shipped to Canada. It also allows you to register for GST or HST. And it's the primary variable that allows you to link all your Canadian accounts, so your import accounts, your GST accounts, your CARM accounts. So ultimately, without a BN number, virtually nothing can be done when importing goods into Canada. The second aspect to look at is the CARM portal. Now, the CARM portal is that primary conduit where all attributes with regards to the importation process are ultimately facilitated through. So this is where all customs documentation is basically validated and where all taxation information is basically validated. It's that central conduit and electronic document database and information database where everything is cross-checked. It's needed because every importer now has to be registered on the CARM portal. So you have to have a CARM account. And this is where your duties, declarations, and importer payments are also facilitated. So without this registration on the CARM portal, your imports cannot clear customs in any way, shape, or form. So this then automatically links to your customs import bond. And this has been one of the larger changes that we've seen implemented into Canada. So going forward now, as of this year, all importers in Canada have to be able to have a customs import bond in place with the CBSA. And this ensures that if there's any duties or shortfall, or if there's any shortfalls or missed payments with regards to duties and taxes, that there's always basically a security deposit with the customs agency. So it's basically a way of them ensuring that they always underwrite their vulnerability or volatility with regards to duties and taxes. And this is mandatory now under the CARM portal for all importers to have this in place. So this will ensure that you can basically continue to facilitate importation privileges into Canada and ensuring that the CRA ultimately always gets their duties and taxes owed to them effectively. So these are the three aspects and three variables that work in unison in order to allow businesses to facilitate importations into Canada. Now, some of the primary challenges, and we've touched on this, but basically without a business number, you are not recognized by either the CRA or the CBSA to actually act as the importer of record of goods or to facilitate any reclamation of import taxes applied to your products. Without a CALM portal, you can actually, your goods might arrive at the border, but you've got no active way to ultimately clear these goods. And the same goes for the bond facility. Although you might have an active CALM account, without a bond facility, you cannot process that customs clearance aspect of the actual shipments of goods. Now, your broker also needs to be approved by the CBSA to facilitate the submission of documentation and data to the CALM portal. So, or you might have a broker, but if they aren't actually registered with the CBSA or CRA to facilitate that process, again, you're up this creek without any way to actually paddle your way out of it. And the last aspect of it is without a GST registration, you are basically leaving 5% of the value of goods on the table. So you're giving an extra 5% import tariff, theoretically, over to the Canadian tax authority that you're not ultimately reclaiming. So the business impact here is quite significant. And this is ultimately where we see things go wrong. And the consequences can be quite severe. So shipments can be delayed for a significant period of time, and this ultimately affects your customers' deliveries and the increased attributed costs through storage fees and the likes of. So without, again, that GST or HST registration, you lose that ability to reclaim those import taxes. And this ultimately just erodes profit margins at the end of the day. And more seriously, without an import bond, you actually cannot clear your goods through customs. So meaning your goods are either going to get returned or destroyed. So this inconsistent import ultimately, if you don't have all of these attributes in place, it can also trigger the CRA to ultimately investigate you. And you cannot use any of these mechanisms to import these goods if you don't have a clean audit record. And these are some of the aspects that we really try to avoid. I think a large context of what we try to do is to be proactive as opposed to being reactive. So all these issues, if not mitigated or actually resolved outright, just create operational drag on a business, which slows down the entirety of your business operations and supply chain when moving goods into this region. So again, what we'll do here is we will ultimately look at the solution. What is the playbook in order to get this done? And we've broken this up into 3 attributes, specifically phase 1, which is the foundation. And this is where you ultimately focus on laying down all the requirements and registering for all the necessary structures that you need to facilitate importations into Canada. So namely your business number, your CALM portal registration, and your customs bond implementation. Once you've got these 3 attributes in place, it actually now moves on to phase 2, which is the activation. So once you've got those 3 things, you can actively start utilizing these structures to facilitate the importation of goods, of these goods into Canada. So with the likes of a licensed customs broker who's approved to facilitate these movements on your behalf, and if you've got a GST registration in place to actually be able to recover that 5% import duty applied to your goods, it allows you to actively engage in the importation process into Canada. And the phase 3 that we speak about is managing and optimizing this process. So by doing this on an ongoing process, you now have an integrated logistics and compliance solution whereby your customs filing, tax records, and shipping data are all working in unison in one unified workflow. So you've now got a system that is predictable, consistent, and allows you to scale. And this is all done by having all your ducks in a row, to speak metaphorically. It also allows you to ensure complete compliance going forward. So you've got clean records that allows you to have faster refunds on that GST reclamation, and ultimately minimizes that audit risk, which is something that's that overarching concern that we all have on an ongoing basis. So to sum that all up, the US and Canada can be critical markets for UK exporters, but in order to navigate these landscapes, although it's never necessarily been more difficult than what it currently has been, it is so doable. And it's all just about aligning your processes, your structures, and to have your documentation and compliance as a priority within your greater logistics movement. So we always try to say, let's mitigate these pitfalls, and because we can see them, we know when they are going to come about. And in order to ensure that you've got something that you can structure and continuously build on, so that you've got a solid structure to start exporting these UK goods into these foreign markets. So thank you very much. I know we've touched on a number of points. If anyone's got any questions, I would be more than happy to run through them, or if you would like me to reiterate any other points that we've touched on today. I've also just left my details here. If there's anything that you would like to reach out to me, you can either reach out to Lauren or myself directly, and we can touch on any of those points. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I can allow you to talk, or you can put them into the chat box, and either of us can give it a read, and then Alessio can answer. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes, and then failing that, we can give everyone some time back. There we go. We have one come in there, Alessio. It's how can you help me again? How to apply for a US importer code?
So, Kim, what we would do in that specific scenario is, because it would ultimately be linked to your UK entity, to your UK business, we would basically endorse your registration with the US Import Authority, and we would actually facilitate that process in getting you registered with the CBP number in the US. So we would basically underwrite that registration for you. And once you've got that, it's provider agnostic. You can utilize it with any importer or any freight forwarder for that matter. But we would help you with getting that process set up. We would give you all the documentation that needs to be completed, as well as any POAs that need to be signed.
Well, if there's no other questions, thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you for taking the time to present, Alessio. It was very insightful. Thank you everyone for joining, and just a reminder from the introduction this morning that I will send the slides. You will find the recording on the Trade Hub, which is our international department side of the Chamber website. I will send all of the links so you know where to find everything. And yes, thank you again. I'll send you some future events in person and online, because we have another webinar next week, which will be with one of our other partners about e-commerce. But yes, thank you all for joining. And again, thank you very much, Alessio. Hope everyone has a lovely day.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Lauren. All the best.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.